Hey, hey. All right. Yeah, that's loud. All right. Good evening. I hope everyone is having a wonderful week so far. We complained about having too much rain, and now we complain about not having any at all. But it is pretty dry. It's been a bittersweet day for me. Today is my daughter's birthday, but she's up at school, and so I'm going to go see her tomorrow evening. Looking forward to that. Hard to believe it's been 21 years. That makes me feel very old in doing that, but a very, very good day. We're going to be talking about tonight chapters 5, 6, and 7 of 1 Kings. A little bit of review bringing us here, thinking about King Solomon coming to power, the great wealth and splendor of his kingdom. And if you read your homework, which I hope that you did, I hope that you were just kind of amazed at just the extravagance of the temple. And it's really almost unbelievable, the extravagance of the temple. But the previous chapters prepare you in knowing that Solomon has the supply of gold, for example, that he needs to overlay the temple. And he's got enough resources at his disposal from an agricultural point of view that we'll talk about a little bit in a minute to trade with the Sidonians for the lumber that he needs. And it's hard to overstate how important this event is in the history of Israel. We think about some of the monumental dates in the history of Israel as a people. What's the biggest monumental date you can think of for the history of the people of Israel prior to this? Leaving Egypt. Leaving Egypt in the Exodus is a monument. It's really the beginning of the Hebrew people because you think about it, they went in, there was just like 70 of them. With just Jacob's family and his extended family and his servants and slaves go into Egypt, and they greatly multiply. They're there for 4 centuries. Some portion of that time they wind up being put into slavery. We're not real sure about exactly when that is because the Bible unfairly doesn't give us the name of a Pharaoh until like the book of 2 Kings or something like that. But we don't know exactly when that was. But the Exodus is a monumental event, really the monumental event. And it's really a motif for becoming a Christian as well and the work of Christ as we think about being freed from slavery and the deliverance. The Passover lamb that Paul makes, because a lamb was not a sacrifice for sin. A lamb was the sacrifice on Passover, but monumental date. And then the next major date that we have that we think about something commemorated is the construction of this temple. Finally, a centralization of worship in Israel. You're aware, now that doesn't mean that Israel does a good job or Judah, when they split and divide here in a little bit, that they do a very good job of remaining central in their worship. But this is a monumental event in the history of Israel. When we think about this temple, completed somewhere around the middle of the 10th century, last about 400 years till the Babylonians destroy it. Which is the next monumental event on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av on the Jewish calendar is a day of mourning even to this day because of the destruction of the temple by the Neo-Babylonians led by Nebuchadnezzar II. We won't get to that in this class because that happens at the end of 2 Kings, and so you'll have to get that on your own reading. If you're in the auditorium class, you guys are going to study that after your Ezra and Nehemiah lessons are concluded. And so we have that. Then what would you think is the next monumental event in the history of Israel that's sad as well? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the temple. Yes, the destruction of the temple in 70 CE by the Roman general Titus. When the Jews continue to pester and pester and pester and pester and pester, and from a Roman perspective, get what they deserve. The Romans were very lenient with the Jews, very not making them be conscripted into the army, allowing them all kinds of leniencies, but the Jews kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And if you want my opinion, Vespasian was far more patient with them than I would have been. But finally, that temple is destroyed, and that temple lay in ruins to today. There is still one outer wall that is remaining over in Jerusalem, now known as the Wailing Wall. Some of you that have traveled there have probably seen that. I know Don has traveled there and probably seen the Western Wall. The central Temple Mount is occupied by a Muslim mosque at this time. And so this is an important part of Israel's history. I think if you read it and you were impressed with the extravagance, I think that's exactly what the author wanted you to be impressed with. This shows, just like the other things, the power and stability that was there with Solomon, the way the Lord was blessing him. The Lord had given him the privilege to build this temple that he withheld from his father David because of David's bloodied hands in battle. Solomon, as far as we know, really didn't have very much of that. And so he is allowed to build the temple. What a privilege. Unfortunately, it builds up a wonderful crescendo that ends in tragedy when Solomon stupidly fails to obey God and unwisely does it. But I'm not going to spoil that for you. That's something we get here in just a little bit. Something else that I recommend to people, we've been doing this as we've been going through some of the major characters of the Hebrew Bible in the Monday morning men's class. We've talked about Solomon recently, and we just talked about Hezekiah this past Monday. Is other sources out there. If you read through the books of the Kings, you will often see, aren't the other things of Hezekiah also recorded in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel and Judah, or the kings of Judah, or the kings of Israel? Works that are no longer extant for us to look at, but we do have some works that you can look at. Now, we're studying 1 Kings. There is additional information about some things that go on in this book in 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 21. But I'm not going to those because I'm not studying 1 Chronicles, or I'm not studying Solomon. I am studying the book of 1 Kings. And so if we were studying the individuals here, then I would use other sources as well as that. Additional source, if you want to be a student of Second Temple Judaism, which I know you all wake up every morning thinking, I would love to be a student of Second Temple Judaism. Well, if you want to understand at all the religious environment of Jesus and his disciples, then you need to be somewhat versed in Second Temple Judaism. But you could buy yourself or download yourself, probably for next to nothing, a copy of Josephus's writings and his Antiquities of the Jews, which Josephus was somewhat contemporary with the New Testament period. It is sort of like your American history books, has a little bit of embellishment in it. It's not necessarily too trustworthy, but it does have some of the same information we get from the Hebrew Bible, but also has some other things in there that may just be oral tradition or things that were handed down in Jewish history that go along with it. It's a very handy tool to have. He also has writings called the Wars of the Jews, and Apology called Against Apion, a Jew. So it's a good resource to have. But you can find this information about that we're going over in the book of 1 Kings there as well. So if you want to get some other reading done on this, if this has piqued your interest historically, there are other writings out there you could look at. This comment was worthwhile, I think, in this monumental event here that we've been talking about. The centralization of worship at the Jerusalem temple would hopefully combat the rise of rival religions and the pollution of the Mosaic covenant faith. Now, this is a problem that Israel struggles with up until the Second Temple period. After exile, or maybe perhaps even in exile, that writings like the book of Jubilees indicates, the Jews eventually get idolatry out of their mind. That's not a problem at all in the New Testament period. For all the faults that Jesus points out, or Paul points out, with the contemporary Jews of their day, idolatry is not an issue. As a matter of fact, one of the strongest things that Jews struggle with is this meat sacrifice to idol issue that we see addressed repeatedly in Paul's writings. And so they have an absolute abhorrence of idolatry. Unfortunately, their forefathers did not. It is a constant struggle. You will see no kings of the northern kingdom that were faithful to God, and only about 5 or 6, and some of them are kind of wishy-washy, that were faithful to God in the southern kingdom of Judah. And so Israel struggled mightily, even in the time of the judges, when they were a tribal confederacy, they struggled with idolatry. Other religions that they did not run out of Canaan when they took it over, religions that infiltrated from the Ammonites or the Moabites or other nations that were around them. And so keep in mind, we're not talking about a time period where you can have instantaneous communication and control. Some of these outlying territories of Israel, they do their own thing, kind of thing. We see them worshiping in high places, setting up altars, doing things. But the hope is we have this centralized location. It had the tabernacle prior to this, and it, it got moved around a little bit. We finally have this that hopefully will focus everyone in and keep the covenant that was made at Sinai and then reiterated again on the plains of Moab in Deuteronomy with these people. So we begin by looking at a little bit of Solomon's political prowess. We'll see this as we go through Solomon's life. His wisdom is renowned. People come to see him. They're astonished by his wisdom. We talked a little bit about the value of wisdom before. King Hiram of Tyre, we'll look at a map here in just a minute about that, but he is a king in the area of Phoenicia. They're very strong into sailing the Mediterranean Sea. If you've heard of the city of Carthage, one of the power in the Mediterranean prior to their defeat by the Romans at in about 202 BCE, they were Phoenician settlements. They had settled all over the Mediterranean world, and so very, very powerful seafaring people along the coast. Modern day Lebanon would be where this territory is today. And so I put an asterisk next to those dates because they're kind of a roundabout thing. When Hiram of Tyre lived, the 969 date seems a little bit late for him to be a contemporary of Solomon, or at least involved in the temple building, so I think that probably dates a little bit earlier than that, but perhaps not. It depends on when we date the temple building. I'm always about plus or minus 5 years when we look at certain dates, especially in the early times of the kings, where they don't give us another historical figure like they do with the Assyrians in 2 Kings to compare to. But Hiram of Tyre, we have kind of zoomed in a little bit on Israel. Down here at the bottom, you can see there is Jerusalem in the central highlands, and then Tyre is up here on the coast of Phoenicia. You may have heard of Tyre and Sidon there along the Phoenician coast. So that's where Hiram is, the cedars of Lebanon. We here in Middle Tennessee call it cedars of Lebanon. You got to take all the vowels out and just say the LBNN. That's how we tend to pronounce it, just Lebanon. But Lebanon is what that place is named after. We have some interesting cities as you move. Then we have Rome and Carthage right next to each other, bitter enemies, just right next to each other on the road. But we have these cedars of Lebanon where Solomon is going to want some timber. So Hiram of Tyre, he sends emissaries to Solomon. It's interesting. Some commentators think about, does this mean that because of Solomon's power, perhaps did he have hegemony over Phoenicia? Was this more of a suzerain vassal type thing where Hiram kind of existed as somewhat of a subordinate to Solomon? I don't know that. I don't think we know enough to know that. Perhaps he's just saying, hey, I've got a very, very powerful neighbor. I'm going to make sure that we're friends and that we're getting along and see if we can do business together. Because trade today and trade back then, same thing, except there's not coinage or dollars. But trading goods is how you made things happen. And so he says, we'll have a treaty between each other. And Solomon says, hey, I need some things from you. He sends back a message there at the beginning of chapter 5. He says, I'm going to build this temple of Yahweh my God. The Lord said my father couldn't do it. I'm going to do it. My servants are going to join your servants. We're going to cut down the cedars from the Lebanon in verse 6 of chapter 5. And interestingly, Hiram comes back and says, okay, this is a mutual advantage thing for both Solomon and Hiram. One thing is Israel gets more access to sea trade. And to benefit for that. And also you have land trade. Hiram is maybe perhaps able to move his goods across Israel. They're all getting along. Everybody's on the same page. And so we got mutual help here. with being friends with one another. And so he says he will send that. What's interesting to me in verse 7, and I think I know the answer to this, and I'll express it to you. I'm not sure that I'm correct, but sometimes we read these things, I think, and maybe make more fuss over than they are. But verse 7 says, Hiram heard the words of Solomon, he rejoiced greatly and said, Blessed be the Lord today. So blessed be Yahweh today, who has given to David a wise son to be over his people. And Hiram says, I got the message. I'm good in doing that. It's interesting that Hiram says this about Yahweh. Well, some people will read this and at the preaching level would say, see, he was a true believer in Yahweh, and he was, yeah, he probably did. He probably believed in 12.5 other gods too. It's not unusual at all for people to recognize the God of another country or the God of a particular city as existing. Now, we don't think that way because we don't think about any other gods existing, but it wouldn't be unusual at all for Hiram to say that. It doesn't mean that he believes in Yahweh and just Yahweh and is following the law of Moses and it might as well be a faithful Israelite. That's reading a lot into that. It's more likely and very likely that he recognizes the God of Israel. And why would he not? And why would he not lifelong commitment to follow Yahweh when in fact we know that Phoenicia worshipped several different gods, including Baal, the storm god, because our beloved Jezebel that comes along at the end of this book is a Phoenician princess. And so they were not a monotheistic people that all believed in Yahweh. But it wouldn't be unusual at all for them to say that. For example, when Cyrus II conquered Babylon, he went and offered to Marduk, the god of the Babylonian city. He offered things to him because that was the god of that city. And so we're not polytheistic. They were. And so it's not unusual at all to do that. So I think perhaps some people read too much into that. And so one of the deals is Hiram's like, hey, you go feed my house. And so Solomon's like, okay, we have agricultural resources to be able to do that. You've got the timber. Let's work out a deal and make that happen. And so an enormous number of people will get recruited to do that. Now, there is some language here that, as we look through the book of 1 Kings, we'll talk about this as we progress, but there is forced labor, corvée labor, if you will, conscripted labor, whatever you want to call it in English, and then there is slaves. There are slaves. Now, the book of Kings is going to tell us later on that Solomon didn't make any slaves of his people. There is a difference between forced labor and slaves. One of those primary differences, you didn't own forced labor. They were not the property of the person that they are working for, whereas slaves were the property of the person that they were working for and could be bought and sold. Forced labor is putting your people to work against their will, or conscripting labor to do that. And so keep in mind, and we'll see later on that they complained to Rehoboam when he takes the throne in the southern kingdom, hey, can you take it easy on us? Your father was very, very hard on us. And Rehoboam replies with a sexual euphemism that we'll talk about when we get to that point. But keep in mind, there's a difference in the ancient world between forced labor and slave labor. Now, that's not to say that the forced labor was very happy about what they were doing, but we see that Solomon is going to send 30,000 laborers, which is an enormous number of people, in 10,000 person groups in monthly shifts to help get the timber or get it cut there. That's an enormous number of people to get this timber back, both for the temple, but one has to imagine it also includes getting things for Solomon's palace, and it takes several years to build the temple. There's also 80,000 burden bearers, if you will, and 70,000 stone cutters. So an enormous amount of labor, really unbelievable numbers as we think about what the population of Israel was there. But just an enormous number of laborers, and then we got 3,300 people overseeing this labor. So an enormous number of people and Israel's labor. Now, perhaps the reason that Solomon sent these people in shifts was you really can't spare that many people from working their fields and doing other things in Israel all at one time. Yeah, we need timber cut for the temple, but we also need fields planted and crops harvested and artisan work to be done. The world doesn't shut down because we're building a temple. We still have to exist. We still have to herd animals. We still have to build buildings. We still have to do things along that line. And so just an enormous number of people involved in that. So as we think about the actual construction of the temple, I'm not going to read through all the details that we have in here, but the beginning is, and this is a time marker for a lot of people. I don't particularly care about dating the Bible necessarily and figuring out all these years and writing out timelines, because it'll make your eyes cross, and hundreds, if not thousands, of people have done that. I don't like to do work that thousands of other people have already done, and so I'll just look it up online and see what I can find. Somebody else has already answered that, or I'll open one of the 24 books I've got about this and see a timeline of history. I don't particularly care. There's a lot of people that get hung up on all this. But if we think about, if we go with what's called an early date for the Exodus, and I'm not going to talk about that debate in here between early and late date for the Exodus, but an early date of the Exodus, then 480 years after that monumental event. Isn't it interesting that we talk about what a monumental event that is in Israel's history, and that is the time marker that they look back and say, okay, it's 480 years after we really started to become a nation. It puts us about 966. And like I said, I like to be about plus or minus 5 or 10 years in these times. Somewhere about the middle of the 10th century. That's how I say things. That way I don't have to worry about people getting all bent out of shape about, well, you didn't get the exact year. Well, that's because not everything happened on January 1st. You know, things happen. Sometimes a king dies in the middle of August, and that was his 40th year. Well, that may have been his 40.6 year, or his 39.8 year, something along those lines. So somewhere in the middle of the 10th century, that's where we place ourselves. And it's interesting as we think about the Bible, if you've been in my classes before, 3, 7, 12, and 40. Those are your multiple choice numbers. If you're going to answer anything about numbers in the Bible, well, 480 is a multiple of 40. And so it's interesting that that is the time that this goes on. And so that's very, very normal. A point of interest is the month that they began was in the month of Zen. That is not sin, that is Zen. It is a Canaanite word, a Hebrew word, generally referring to it probably started in April and May. We don't really care that that's when it started, but understand their year did not start on our January 1st. I know it's hard to believe that's the case, but in general, the calendar year for the Jews and just about anybody else on earth was the vernal equinox in the spring, which happens around March 20th, I think 20th or 22nd. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it is the point at which the sun has gone as low in the sky as it's going to go and begin to make its northward journey back towards the equator in the summertime. And so this starts in April, May. Who cares? Because it lasts like 7 years in doing that. If you look at the dimensions of the temple, I put approximate here. Many of you may have a diagram in your Bible, or if you've got books about the history of Israel, you may have a diagram of the temple. I'm going to show you some artist representation. Unfortunately, all the Polaroids that were taken of Solomon's temple have been lost to time. We do not have any of those pictures. All the eyewitnesses, none of them drew us a painting. We don't have that. What I can tell you is it probably looked extremely ornate based on what I see here, and I would not want any of the walls to fall on me because they were overlaid with gold, and gold is heavy. And so we also have the issue of a cubit. Now, a cubit was about 18 inches. Now, that may be very different, just like if we went back to the Middle Ages in England and we used a foot, that may very well depend on who the king was and measuring his foot. We're still one of the last places on this planet that still uses the crazy, stupid standard. We don't use a metric system. Your children's math would be so much easier. You don't even comprehend how much easier math is if you don't deal with the English units. But we think about a foot. Now it is standardized, 12 inches. And so I've heard people say the cubit is the distance from the wrist to the elbow, or the elbow to the tip of the fingers. Who knows? And it may very well have been different to tell. A cubit in Babylon and a cubit in Jerusalem and a cubit in Damascus maybe have very been different. But roughly 2,700 square feet. Now, that's not that big, really. I want to tell you, you're in a room right now that is about 8,000 square feet. Okay, so about a third of this building, this room that you're in, this auditorium is roughly 80 by 100, and it's 50 feet tall if you want to know that. I know you've been dying to know how tall the middle of the auditorium is your entire life. or at least the time you've been here at Mount Juliet. But so keep in mind that I'll tell you it's high up there because I've been up there replacing bulbs before, and it's high and it's hot. I can tell you that. I'm glad we went to LED, so we don't do that anymore. But 2,700 square feet, just really not that big. Many of you probably live in houses that are larger than that, and so it's not huge. I know sometimes we look at pictures of the temple and we expect it to be this sprawling Parthenon. It's really just not that big of a location. If a cubit is roughly 18 inches, it's about 45 feet tall. I've seen some people claim it to be 3 stories tall. Well, where I come from, that's 30 feet, roughly. I guess the story depends on how much the story of that building is, but maybe that's bigger. Some of you guys that are architects may tell me that the story is more than 10 feet, maybe it's 12 feet, but 45 feet tall. So not all that gigantic. So to give you a little bit of, I think the highest point in temple was a little bit shorter, probably about the height of that center beam up there that's holding this entire building together, is about that height right there. And so not a gigantic space as we think and talk about that. Primary composition is stones and cedar wood. Now, one good thing about the temple is, now some of you young people here are not going to think about this, but you can hang your clothes in the temple and you never get any moss, right? All that cedar, I bet that place smelled strong. Now, you have to, no wonder you had to put gold over that stuff. I mean, you walk in there, the cedar smell would knock you down. Now, I don't know if cedar trees, I am not by any means an arborist. I do not know if cedar trees back then, and the word is translated cedar here. I'm sure someone has written a dissertation on that would bore you to tears. That cedar and cypress and oak and all this stuff that we pick may not be exactly the same wood that we are thinking of. Certainly a wood that lasted a long time because the roof and the supports of this thing made of cedar, and it lasts 400 years. Now, we can't put together anything in America that lasts 40 years. 400 years is a long, long time. And so we also have this interesting thing about stones. Those of you who read your homework, what was interesting about the requirement for the stones? Yeah, nothing was going to be cut on site. And there's a lot of conjecture about why that is. Was it a holy place? Didn't want a lot of noise and racket going on at the place? I don't know exactly. We do have some Old Testament thought about uncut stones completely. In Exodus and Deuteronomy, we see when God asked them to build an altar, He said, don't cut the stones at all. Do not make them of cut stones, and do not build it out of hewn stones. And in Deuteronomy, we see there also, do not build it out of hewn stones. So those don't seem like really good parallels because they have to cut these stones and make square blocks out of them or what you've got to do or customize them to fit. But I don't really know the reason. I'm sure there's probably some out there. I did not take the time to look that up, but perhaps it's a reverent situation, stone cutting, and perhaps related to not hewing things in the presence of the Lord. Also, you don't need to walk up on the stones of the altar with no underwear on because you're not going to expose your nakedness to the stones. That's interesting when we also see that. I didn't put that up there, but if you look in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy, you'll see that you don't walk up on the stones with your garment exposed and uncover your nakedness upon holy stones. And so that's a sidebar. You get that for free tonight. And so for some reason they did not want these stones cut. I don't know, maybe I missed it. I didn't see it in the reading. I don't remember about cutting wood on site. But keep in mind, we're not talking about buzz saws and a mill here or skill saws. Everything would have been sawn by hand. And you saw stone as well, which is probably quite a bit louder than that. The fit of the finish of the place, if you read, it is very much like Garden of Eden type imagery that we see. And this is important for New Testament studies. If you have read Revelation and you've been in any class where I've taught Revelation, I've got me and about 6 people live on the same little island in my interpretation of Revelation and what it means, but we think we're right. But one of the things for sure is the imagery in Revelation is very, very much taken from the Old Testament. A lot of temple imagery, A lot of imagery from the Garden of Eden, a tree of life, things that we see, a flowing river of life. And so a lot of imagery there. In the temple also as well, a lot of images from botany and plants. But then we also see cherubim flanked on each side, and I've got an artist's rendering of that. Cherubim, which would be a composite of human and animal looking and very large. But we remember what was left standing at the garden after humankind was expelled from there was a cherubim with a flaming sword, if memory serves, to keep things out. So a very much garden of image type thing, but everything overlaid with gold. I can't even imagine the amount of work it was to do that. And also, as we'll see with the building, with the things that are put in the temple, Israel's not known for its metallurgy and its metalworking capabilities, its smithing abilities. We see even at times they have to rely on the Philistines for their sword making. We'll see that another Hiram, not the same Hiram that's king, is brought in by Solomon to make vessels of bronze, to work bronze. And I think bronze, if memory serves again, we talked about this the other day, is an alloy of copper and tin. I think brass is copper and zinc. But bronze, somebody had to work and fashion bronze. So to be able to smelt gold, to hammer gold out into sheets and mount it over these things, and have the things inlaid of all these different, plants and other images that are carved in, it's just amazing to me the amount of work that was in. I'll tell you what it reminds me of. When I was in high school, we took a trip to Europe. And we went to Spain and to France and then over to England. And when I was in France, I got to go to Notre Dame. This is pre-Great Fire, obviously. And I just sat there in awe of a medieval cathedral where everything in there was built and carved by hand. And just the intricacies of the carving on the capitals and the walls and the sides and the flying buttresses and all of those things that craftsmen spent a whole lot of time in stained glass and all the things in there. Just the intricacies of it were amazing to me because, we don't see anything that old when you're 16 years old in this country. There's nothing that even approaches the age of things. And so that is a memory of mine that will always be there, just being amazed at the dedication that people had to carve those things out of stone and how much sweat equity had to go into that. And just how beautiful it was. And then also I think about Versailles. And if any of you guys have ever been to Versailles, just how ornate that place is, the lavish amount of money that's spent. I just think about that kind of everything overlaid with gold and ordained, decorated with things. That's the kind of lavishness that I see when I picture this temple. And this is even beyond those type of things as we go in there. It just is a magnificent thing to see. There is a most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant would be stored. Only the high priest could go in there. It is a perfect cube. This is compared to when we see this symbolic New Jerusalem listed. We see also a perfect cube in this sense. Many people think there's a relation with those things. I don't know. But we have very, very large cherubim in there as well. And it took about 7 years to complete this temple. And so that seems like a long time to us in construction. But keep in mind, this is manual labor, putting this thing together. A few artist renderings there are anybody's guess. One of the things that I always appreciate is the size of the altar that probably had to be there to sacrifice as many animals as much and as often as had to be done for the people of Israel. And then I've got some closer up things of this sea and these basins. This is just an artist rendering that we may see of the two pillars at the front, the vestibule, the nave, and then walking into the sanctuary. You have side storage. You also, the temple of your God is also where you stored a lot of your gold and your silver because it's under divine protection in that. Just kind of a zoom in on the same picture. I just can't imagine the walls being made out of gold. I mean, it's just an incredible thing to think about. Gold plated. The Ark of the Covenant was gold plated too. And that was made with the spoils they took out of Egypt. But we're talking about a little bitty old box the size of a footlocker overlaid with gold. I can't even imagine the amount of work that went in to overlaying this place with gold. This is one interesting rendition of the cherubim. I'm pretty sure they look nothing like that. but size and everything, just to give you a little bit of scale on each side of the Ark of the Covenant. What an amazing sight. Now, nobody got to see this. It would be neat during construction to be able to say, hey, son, I saw the inside there because I worked on those cherubim, and nobody else gets to go in there except the high priest now once a year. That place probably needed dusting, didn't it? You probably needed somebody go in there and dust the place. And so we have this magnificent guardians standing on each side of those things. The word of the Lord came to Solomon here. He reminded him, as for the temple you are building, if you walk in my statutes, observe my ordinances, and keep all my commands by walking in them, I will fulfill my promise to you, which I made to your father David. I will dwell among the Israelites and not abandon my people Israel, if you follow the rules. That's the covenant. That's the covenant that Israel broke, and it's broken to this day. Israel's covenant with God is broken. It's done. There's no obligation on God's behalf to give them land or anything else. That covenant was wrecked by Israel. Think about the furnishings that we have in there. This is a different Hiram of Tyre. He is half Israelite. I think he has an Israelite mother and a Phoenician father. But he is obviously someone who is good in bronze smithing. These two pillars, Boaz and Yakin, we see that one means in strength and the other means he will establish. In Hebrew, that's the best that I understand what that means. This sea is really that gigantic tub out there. Don't picture that Solomon built an ocean with a marina and all those kind of things. We think about a huge one. I did a little bit of math. I had to break out my engineering mind and remember my formula for the volume of a cylinder and get that back in my mind and thinking about the size of it. Huge, 10 to 12,000 gallons, symbolic or functional. It's so tall, nobody could get into it without a ladder. But there are several other little basins made. This is the one held up by the 12 oxen or bulls, and we think 12 is of the 12 tribes of Israel. This, I said again, is one artist's rendering of it. I don't know if all the kids in Israel tried to climb up on that and stick their finger in there, and dads had to beat the stew out of them for doing that or whatnot, but I doubt it. I doubt they got anywhere near something like that. Not really sure even how you fill that kind of thing up, but very, very big and very, very tall. We do see several basins and stands that are created. Some scholars believe those may have been for ritual washing. Obviously, priests could not wash their hands or their garments in that big old thing, so you have ritual washing. It's not about germ theory, it's about ritual purity. But other people, they gold-plated incense, altar, lampstands, bread table, fire pan, all the furnishings. I don't want to call it silverware and flatware, but all those kind of things were built by people other than the people from Israel. Something that is noticeably absent in 1 Kings is God's instructions for the design and size and composition of the temple. If you recall, sometime in your daily Bible reading commitment, probably about the time you quit, the details that God gave for the tabernacle, down to the color of the threads, how long the poles were, extreme detail that is a cure for insomnia for thousands of years to go and to read that. But God gives extremely minute detail about the tabernacle, but he doesn't voice that to Solomon here. Here in 1 Kings is the key thing. However, we learn from the chronicler that David gave Solomon, his son, the plan of the vestibule of the temple and of its houses, its treasuries, its upper rooms, its inner chambers, and of the room for the mercy seat, meaning the Holy of Holies, if you will, and the plan of all that he had in mind for the courts of the house of the Lord, all the surrounding chambers, the treasuries, and the dedicated gifts. He said, all this he made clear to me in writing from the hand of the Lord, all the work to be done according to the plan. Solomon was given the plans for the temple, is what the chronicler tells us. And so God didn't have to voice that out. Apparently, David already had those plans, and Solomon was following that. I don't necessarily think you get that information from 1 Kings. One interesting thing that we see in the New Testament is these things serving as a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. As Moses was warned when he was about to complete the tabernacle, God told him that. For God said, be careful that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain, which means Moses was either taking notes or had a tremendous memory because he told him a lot of things. There's a lot of thought about that the tabernacle and even perhaps the temple a reflection, maybe even symbolically, of what is seen in heaven. This is sort of the premise behind some of the vision in Revelation. There's a little bit of Platonic thought in that as well, that there are things that are perfect, and some things that are made here are just a copy of those things, and they're not wholly as complete as what is that. So Solomon performed the house of the Lord. He got all that work done. He brought in offerings. We're going to read about that next week. You've only got one chapter to read for next week. It's kind of long, but you've only got one chapter to read. He put all the gold and the utensils, and he put all of them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. Solomon also built, we're told about almost like an excursus in your reading, his own palace. Now, his palace was larger than the temple. It looks like almost it's an interruption in the work for the temple. The scholars differ on this because it's kind of inserted right there in the middle of the temple before Hiram comes in and does all the bronze smithing. But that may just be a narrative flow. I don't particularly think that. I think he built the temple in 7 years, and he built it, I think the text will tell us that. And then he also built his palace. So I don't really necessarily think so. It is 11,000 square feet, so it is substantially larger, nearly 4 times the size of the temple. There's nothing wrong with that, right? People are like, well, he built a bigger palace than he did the temple. But the Lord gave him the plans for the temple. So if the Lord wanted it bigger, he should have given bigger plans. And so there's nothing sinful about him making a magnificently large palace. You know, we make buildings for our government housing that's way bigger than they need to be and way more ornate and 10 times expensive. Congress could meet in a metal shed if they wanted to. But we have very, very ornate buildings that are designed to show off power and authority. The same thing for Solomon's temple. Nobody's going to respect Israel if Solomon lives in an outhouse. Okay, so there's nothing sacrilegious about him making a bigger. He was given the plans for the temple. He built it to the size he was told to build it to. Some larger stones, it says these stones are 12 to 15 feet long, gigantic stones. Moving them around is somewhat of a mystery. We think about how big those things may have been. And so for a lot of people, they say, well, it made it bigger than the temple. Is this self-indulgent or is it pragmatic? I tend to think of it as being pragmatic. And I said that and alluded to that a minute ago, and let me explain that a little bit. We're not going to like this thought either, but the number of concubines and wives that I had as a king was a way of getting respect in the ancient world. You know, everything that I have in number. Remember those ridiculous numbers that you'll see about Solomon's horses and his stalls and his chariots? I mean, all these things are just the ridiculously high numbers, this many, many, many talents of gold that he gets all the time. You know, these things are made to show power, and he's very, very blessed by God. It also shows that the God of Israel blessed his people mightily by having all these riches and wealth. That, I think, is how an ancient Near Eastern people would picture Solomon's power and his wisdom given to him by Solomon's God, is for him to have all these riches, an ornate palace, all these servants, an absurd amount of food consumed, an absurd amount of food sent to Hiram as a supply. And so keep in mind, don't let somebody tell you that, well, it was selfish in Solomon. This is Solomon's first step towards being a sinner. It's not. The scriptures elsewhere tell us that Solomon was given the plans for the temple. And so if God wanted a 15,000 square foot temple, he would have given David the size of that. He didn't need those things. And if you find other ancient temples, they're not necessarily all that gigantic in size and scope. I know I haven't given you guys any opportunity to answer any questions, but I'm going to give you a whopping 1 minute to do that. So next week, read 1 Kings chapter 8. Are there any things that you have a question about? I'll have to cover them next week. Sorry about that. I didn't give enough time for that. Nothing? You all understood the text perfectly? Yes, sir.
The thing that stuck out to me is where he was told, if you obey me, keep my commandments and all that, then I'll be with Israel. So Israel's well-being in the future is dependent on one man being faithful.
Yes. Yeah. It would be what he said was Israel's future. It says it depends on you. And what we see is, we're not going to, this is spoiler alert, but as these kings fail repeatedly to follow God, the people follow right in behind them. in the ancient world, your king was your go-between between you and God. He's supposed to be the one that was right with God and pleasing to God, administer the justice by his gods. And so, yeah, the leadership of Israel was supposed to be godly. Solomon was supposed to write down a copy of the entire law for himself. As far as I know, he never did do that. And so, yes, it's a point. And we will kick off with that next week. Appreciate that point. All right. Y'all have a good rest of your week, and God bless.